I just want to make sure that I understand the conversation we're about to have, the parameters. I want to play a game. No.
Okay. Let me hit my tape recorder.
It's still tapes. This is still micro cassettes. Not
you
even
put on your pig mask first.
You have no context for the movie we're going to talk about, Spiral, from the book of Saw, which is the most literate part of this entire film, is the fact that it has book in the title. You've not seen any of Saw 1 through 8. You haven't seen Saw 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, Saw 3D, or Saw Jigsaw, as what
chapter?
It was.
Oh, Jigsaw, yeah.
The final chapter, I think it was Saw 3D, the final chapter, which it wasn't. Much like Friday the 13th, they made more of them afterwards.
Of course.
And this Spiral actually reminds me of another Friday the 13th, The New Beginning. I don't know if you have seen that. Was the one
I haven't seen that either.
Whoa!
I know.
It's the one
I heard it was good.
The fake Jason. No.
That was bad? Okay. Maybe I heard something else.
It's awful, but it's also one of the best Friday the 13th movies because it's so different. In the case of Spiral, it is awful. It is very different from the other Saw movies. In fact, I was thinking about this because you've not seen the other Saw films. I'm a big fan of this franchise.
Really? Okay.
Oh yeah, like big. And until last year, when I went and I rewatched all of them up through Jigsaw for the Halloween Scare-a-thon, I had this opinion that, they're not that great, like parts 5, 6, and 7. But then rewatching them again, I got more, entertainment out of them. But the last one, Jigsaw, is just, it's terrible. And so when I found out they were rebooting or doing another entry, whatever they're going to do with Chris Rock behind it, I was like, that could be interesting. And I gave it a lot of leeway, a lot of room in my heart. I'm like, I'm going to check this out and go in with an open mind. Nope, that was ill-founded trust.
And your heart started to get closed off the more you watched it.
Yep, and it helped that I was, we were kind of Facebook messaging each other while the movie was going on.
Yeah, it shows you how invested we were.
Yeah, there were brief messages, but mostly about like the misery. But no, here's the thing. I was thinking about this watching the movie and thinking about you.
Well, thank you.
It's as if we were going to be discussing, or you were going to start with Superman 4, The Quest for Peace.
Wow.
Knowing that Superman 1 and 2 are out there. The fear being you watch Superman 4, The Quest for Peace, being like, I want nothing to do with anything else in this series ever.
Just try to think about that. That's probably the worst depiction of Luthor. You got John Cryer as his nephew, Mariel Hemingway. Lois isn't barely even in it. Oof, that was awful. Anyway, yes, I did save myself just for you, Ian.
Oh,
I know.
It's been forever since anyone said that to me.
I kept myself a Saw virgin.
Oh, now it sounds like something out of 7.
I kept myself a Saw virgin for this Saw version. And it was not a diversion. Anyway, the curiosity factor was somewhat similar to you because Chris Rock was involved. And I was thinking, you know what? It's always cool to see a performer that one way, primarily one way, and to see him veer out. Now, he's done action movies before. If you remember The Great Bad Company by Joel Schumacher with him and Anthony Hopkins.
No, I didn't see it.
It's something. And then, of course, Lethal Weapon 4.
I didn't see that one either.
Yeah, well. And then he did do a rom-com with, I think it was Julie Delpy, 2 Days in Paris, I think. Good. He was good. It's still a comedy, but more of a drama. So, look, we've seen comedians veer into all different types of material, So it's possible. And I thought that, he primarily approached the chairman of Lionsgate at some wedding in Brazil about this. I mean, how does that come up? Hey, I know we're at a wedding, but man, I love them Saw movies.
I think that should be the last Chris Rock impression we do on this episode so we don't get canceled.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Let's not do that. Um, ah, um, didn't he reference New Jack City in this movie?
He did.
And he was in that movie. Anyway,
Yes, yes, he was.
okay. So what I was getting at is like, if he's truly a fan, Chris is a guy. Chris, Chris Rock is a guy who's also directed and produced. So I'm just thinking, if this guy is so enthusiastic about doing some iteration of Saw, why not give him the keys and have him direct and co-write and everything and all that, and make it totally different, and not make it a one-off, some kind of a veering into a different direction. And look, yes, I've never seen a Saw movie, but to me, this just has too many elements of a Saw movie. I mean, it's just, come on, it could have gone, and we'll get to it, but I think there's a good story here that could have been like underneath it all, that could have been minus all the, get rid of all the Saw stuff, and this could have been a really good, and delve more into the kind of, Chris Rock kind of plays a lousy character. He's kind of a jerk, but he is still a pariah of a police precinct because of what he did 12 years ago when he ousted his partner who shot a witness.
Yeah.
So that is very interesting. And the fact that his father was a police chief who was also kind of corrupt, played by Samuel L. Jackson. Coming into all of that is, Rock is essentially playing a character who's probably one of the few who's not corrupt. Okay, we assume.
I think probably the only one. On some level in this police department. Yeah.
Even though his introduction in this movie is maybe I'm just not all there, but it was a little confusing to me.
Very confusing,
just because it's like, okay, is this a stakeout? Or him and are these his cop buddies? Is this in the past? Is this in the present? They're all going into some. It looks like some apartment or something, or that they're robbing this person. These people. I don't know. It's a little unclear. So it would. And of course, he starts off with this monologue about how Forrest Gump couldn't be made in today's modern day. And I'm like, why do we choose? Okay, we're doing something. The problem is that is something we expect from a Chris Rock movie. Mm-hmm. That kind of character of like having a kind of like a meta monologue, comedic monologue about movies, and so yes, maybe that's a deviation from the Saw movies, and that's okay, cool, it's different and new, but it's also a little hard to get invested in who this character is right away. It's a strange introduction, just like I said, because it just feels so Chris Rock.
That's the problem, though, is I wasn't seeing Chris Rock's character of Zeke Banks in this movie. From the opening moments, I was seeing Chris Rock. And it's strange because he delivers his monologue about Forrest Gump, which came out in 1994. Later on, there's an overt reference to Pulp Fiction. Did you catch that with the
I did not.
Okay. Later in the film, much later, towards the climax, I guess, when something terrible happens to the police chief involving hot wax, and I'm not talking about something she paid for.
Yeah.
The door that is in the records room is like this giant bank vault looking thing, and the name of the company is Vincent and Jules. The two main characters from Pulp Fiction, which Samuel L. Jackson, who's also in this movie, that was the movie that made his career. So it's like this weird series. It's a spiral of in-jokes that they forgot to tie into the point of the movie. I feel like you could have been tightening up the script in lots of other places instead of this cute nonsense. But yeah, I agree. I was watching Chris Rock, and he's so I love him as a performer and as a stand-up comic,
Yeah.
but I don't know if he was doing the Joel Schumacher thing of like not trying to be really dramatic because it's a horror movie, but he stuck out like a sore thumb. In the original Saw movie, Carrie Elways was the star, one of the stars of that. And,
Mhm.
his biggest claim to fame, I think before that had been either Princess Bride or maybe The Crush with Alicia Silverstone. But he wasn't like prancing around with his, he wasn't playing Wesley in that movie. He was actually acting, playing creating a real character.
Mhm.
So it's disappointing to see, and again, you have no context for this, but how far this series has fallen from people taking this really seriously, trying to make some genuinely scary movies with some great moral dilemmas and some cool body horror. Although in the first Saw movie, they could show
Mm.
that on TV today. It's not until Saw 2 where they really get into the gore effects, because much like the Human Centipede, it developed this reputation of people thinking they saw things that they didn't. It's like, oh my God, this guy saws his leg off. It was so gory. And it's like, you don't see it. Uh,
Yeah.
you know, but so the point is, he may have had a passion for this, Chris Rock, but he either doesn't understand it, or there wasn't anybody from the franchise to step in and say, you need to calm your horses there, buddy. This is
Well,
not what we're supposed to be doing here.
I think maybe they even did that. I mean, I think that's what they said, because the director here is the same guy who directed like 4 of the Saw movies.
Yes.
Like, no, this is his 4th.
Darren Lynn Bousman, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and James Wan and Lee Winnell are co-producers here, along with like 7 or 8 other producers. So there's still, it's like some of the same people are still touching this franchise.
But I don't know how much they're actually touching it, because unless it was kind of a dick waving contest between, we're the people who built this $1 billion horror franchise versus, but I'm Chris Rock,
Yeah.
because it doesn't feel like anybody who has their name attached to this picture had any creative input. It's kind of like how Steven Spielberg executive produced the Transformers movies. He wasn't on set or telling Michael Bay what to do.
It's just his name moves buildings and robots.
Yeah.
I wish it would have been like, hey, I'm Chris Rock. If I'm going to get invested in this and do this, I want to do things differently and, make some things happen. It's a weirdly like paced film. Especially like, I'm not a huge fan of flashbacks to begin with, but some of these flashbacks just seemed like, like, I hate to say it, it just felt like we're gonna have the flashbacks be directed by this student film kid. It just seemed like it was a totally different thing. Now I know flashbacks can sometimes they put on a different color palette just to make it look like a different time period, and the way they made Samuel Jackson and Chris Rock look younger was ridiculous. They basically just said, hey, Chris Rock, put a goatee on.
Yeah, like a sprayed on black goatee.
And hey, Samuel Jackson, we're going to give you this walrus mustache. What? I mean...
Well, the flashbacks stylistically, they have looked like that in other Saw movies, that kind of like a washed out palette.
Okay.
But they were at least directed. I mean, these things are so flat. On top of that, there was the corrupt partner that Zeke had, who shot the guy. I kept trying to figure out, and it wasn't until the very end when I realized it was just a confluence of probably bad makeup to make the character look younger. But I kept thinking, that's not really Mickey Rourke in disguise, is it? Because he just looked like one of those things where they were going to have a character or an actor who was in the film, but who was made up to look like someone else, so there could be a reveal at the end.
Right.
But it wasn't that. It was just oddly put together. It's just kind of unsettling, but also boring at the same time.
Yeah. So one of the reasons why I haven't watched a Saw movie before is just because I kind of find that I have and I know it's not necessarily the first movie, but I kind of have a low threshold for, you know, the kind of torture stuff and the entrapments and the gruesome, you know, grisly, bloody stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, I'm also a huge fan of Seven, David Fincher's movie. Now, granted, you don't see necessarily, well, you don't always see what has transpired.
It's very much the aftermath of
Yeah,
the
aftermath
killings. Yeah.
in Seven, we don't really see that. So, but and that's what's very interesting because you know less is more, and it leaves more to the you know the imagination of the viewer. So, of course, with these movies, the whole gimmick is what can we do with another movie, you know, and what kind of traps can we create for these, you know, morally, you know, vapid, you know, vacant, you know, corrupt people. You know, we're going to teach them a lesson by playing a game. You know, having them, you know, get challenged in some way. You know, you could, you know, you could save your family but you have to saw through this. You know, whatever. You know, it's like okay. Um, and so watching this, you know, the first scene, the first kill in the subway was a cop, you know, who's chasing this guy. I don't know why. Yeah. Because he nabbed somebody's purse in a 4th of July outdoor celebration carnival thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so he decided, first of all, we don't even know why the cop's there.
The way he's introduced, it's almost like he's on a stakeout or something, or like he's doing something else, but then he goes after this purse snatcher. I don't know if he was off duty or what, but what it reminded me of, it was so obnoxious, down to the wardrobe this guy was, you know, wearing. We talked about it a little bit. The original Superman. The cop follows
Luther's
lackey
Otis.
Otis, down into the subway, and you know he ends up getting pushed out by the wall, and that like really that thing like messed me up as a kid. I'm like, oh my god, this is horrifying.
It's terrible. Why would you do that?
But it's essentially the same thing, except at the end of the tunnel there's a saw trap. But you know the guy was wearing that goofy white hat. It looked like something out of the late 70s. I'm like, why are you dressed like that? Oh, because we're going to rip off Superman.
Right. Well, it reminded me of that whole sequence, but it also reminded me of like what Anthony Hopkins was wearing at the end of Silence and Lambs. You know, I'm having some old friends for dinner, and you see him walking away, and he's got the hat and the white kind of sport coat. That's the last time I'll do an Anthony Hopkins impersonation. But so one of the things is like I have a hard time. We don't know who this guy is, but I have a hard time believing that this guy is going to go out of his way to follow a guy down a manhole because of here's a purse snatcher. I mean, think about it. You can call for backup and say, hey, he went down that way. Once you go down a manhole, how many other places do you have to go? So you could call backup and you could have people, you know, and it's a subway too. I'm like, come on.
Well, it also doesn't make sense now that you mention it for what we find out about his character. He was a corrupt detective who his punishment was basically having his tongue ripped out because he loves to go on the stand and like lie in order to put people away.
Mm-hmm.
Like that guy's going to go after a purse snatcher. It just doesn't seem.
Like, and it's a taste. Well, no pun intended, but it's a taste of what's to come. Because all of these cops, save maybe Rock's character, are and maybe one other person, but are all pretty much idiots. They all act stupidly.
They act stupidly. They're petulant, and that gets to sort of the heart of one of the things I think makes this movie so ugly and conflicted is when we get to the end of it. And I know here's a little bit of behind the scenes movie critics magic, everybody. David and I had to sign non-disclosure agreements before watching this movie. I don't even know. I didn't read the whole thing. I'm sorry. But I don't know if we're even allowed to talk about the fact that we didn't sign an NDA. If it means I no longer am able to watch Saw films in advance, then, you know, I'll take the punishment. But but no, this is not the kind of movie that requires that degree of secrecy. But what I was going to say, I totally lost my train of thought. I went down a
Well,
rabbit hole of NDAs.
you
We're talking
sure?
about the corrupt cops.
Downward spiral. Yeah, the corrupt cops, and it is such a ripcord effect for me when I see, especially in crime thrillers or cops, when I see cops acting stupidly. It's just like, how many times does if a cop doesn't call for backup,
Mm-hmm.
and he or she they're going further and further into the point of no return. We the viewer usually knows more than them, the character. How frustrating is it for us to just watch, somebody, especially when it's like, somebody who's a little bit more seasoned, come on. You're just going to walk in, especially that, like the kind of grizzled older detective who is kind of like a Harvey Bullock or Detective Fitch.
Mm-hmm.
He goes in on his own, and almost the whole time he's searching for this kind of, I guess he's kind of like a vagrant homeless guy. And he's searching for him, maybe to get some information. And the whole time he's just like, he kind of nudges where he thinks the guy's sleeping, and it turns out, it's just a pig mask. That's not alarming to you? Come on. All right. So then he gets on his phone, and he's not looking around or anything. I'm like, come on, man.
He's standing there in the complete dark. Like, he doesn't go to cover himself. He's like, nothing. I guess there's no one here in this giant room, even though I pursued someone in this direction. I remember what I was going to say, my point.
Mm-hmm.
This movie is conflicted, I'm saying, because it's about a ostensibly not a jaded and bitter cop, but not a corrupt cop, Chris Rock's character. But everybody else in the department and all the police are, villainous, corrupt idiots. This feels like there's a weird socio-political undertone to this movie. But especially in the final scene with what happens to Samuel L. Jackson's character. We can get into that later, maybe. Yeah. But there's almost this weird all cops are bastards kind of a thing underlying the Saw movies. Now, the Saw movies have gotten political before, like Saw 6 is explicitly about the 2008-2009 healthcare crisis. Mm-hmm. And it was very interesting and well done, and not as ham-handed as this issue is here. I just don't think they've figured out quite what the issue is. I can understand the anti-cop sentiment coming out of what's happened with, unarmed black men in the last several years. So fine, make a movie about that, I guess. But when you've got the two protagonists being two black actors, one of them is corrupt and one of them isn't, and they're not really speaking to the themes of the movies in the movement in their actions.
No.
It's just, this movie says it wants to be about something, but it's really about nothing.
It's easily being vague about everything. Yes. There's no hard approaches. There's no nuances. There's no deliberateness really in kind of heavy hitting issues. Yet they're dancing around them. And, gosh, police corruption has been around for decades. Okay. The 70s movies touched on it, all sorts of, police corruption's always been in movies. Okay. It's always been in real life. So yes, it's been, a lot police, brutality. That's another thing that's been maybe a bit more recent, but this movie, the targets in this movie are all corrupt police. Okay.
But you might as well just say the targets in this movie are all police, because
in this movie, they're all corrupt police.
Well, right. But even Chris Rock's character, even though he's not corrupt, he's been so denigrated and weighed down by the idiocy and the maliciousness of everybody else on the force who are constantly bullying him. They put a dead rat in a trap on his desk, that it's like there's just no positivity, no positive portrayal of cops in this at all.
Yeah. And, his captain's useless. Everybody around him, and that's why, I think that there's actually a very interesting and good story here about, wanting to do good in an environment where it's just like not accepted, that's interesting. That's, you could really play that out into something really compelling. Not this movie though, and I can't think of any kill in this movie where the cop was actually doing something smart.
No, no.
No.
And that's one of the frustrating things about having this particular conversation, is there have been other traps in other films where either the people have escaped, or the traps have not worked, or they have worked when they weren't supposed to. So you can
Hmm.
do, even though the traps are ostensibly all about like how much blood can we, explode on the screen, they're usually very smart. And there's something more going on with the either the trap itself or the character in the trap and for a reason than we get in this movie. Because yeah, it is all just cops and they're all going to get killed. There's no illusion that any one of them is going to make it out. And so there's no suspense. Like some of the other Saw movies, and not all of them, but they usually have some kind of a suspenseful thriller element to it. It's not like a Friday the 13th movie,
Hmm.
where you're going there just for the gore. And it's laughable because at one point, I think Chris Rock and Sam Jackson, or maybe it's Chris Rock and his partner, played by, was it
Max Minghella.
Max Minghella? Yeah. There was some kind of a quip, like they're talking about the old Jigsaw murders.
Yeah.
And is someone copycatting Jigsaw? And he's like, no, Jigsaw never went after cops. I'm like, are you kidding me? Like Saw 2
well,
through like all of them, like
well, let,
the cops were the central characters in those movies.
well, let me ask you that though, because I've never seen them. Would the cops in this movie realize that, or would they know that Jigsaw used to go after? I mean, okay, I guess my question is, did Jigsaw in the past deliberately go after cops, or were cops just involved in tracking down who's doing these killings?
Without getting too much into it, because that's a very interesting question, because it brings up the point of how much about Jigsaw, how much of the truth that is, you mentioned when we're watching these movies, we as the viewer are privy to things that the characters aren't.
Sure, sure.
So the Jigsaw killings in this universe are, legendary because they went on for years and they involved all these grisly traps. But
Okay.
as far as the intricacies of what was going on with particularly the cop characters, there were so many secrets going on between those characters, and so many of them ended up dead that it'd be impossible to like write the
Yeah,
definitive book about the Saw series. So yeah,
sure.
it might just be like, yeah, he was pursued by cops and he got,
And
locked
it could
up
have
or
been,
whatever.
a rumor mill passed on for years and years and years. What I would have really liked, and this could have been really interesting and kind of meta, is okay, what if this movie was set in a world where the the Jigsaw killings were not necessarily real, but so those didn't really happen in real life, but they were these cops are aware, and people in this movie are aware of the Saw movies.
Yeah, I mean, but you're getting into, Blair Witch 2, Book of Shadows
I
territory,
don't know that either.
Human Centipede 2, all the movies that you've smartly avoided. This trope has been done to death. So I'm kind of glad that they didn't, because it always starts out as an interesting idea. Like, what if the first movie was just a movie and the second movie is about the culture reacting to that movie? But
Okay,
it turns out it's all real.
is that what Book of Shadows is about?
Yeah, yeah.
And then didn't they have the remake? Adam Wingard did a
Yes, but the remake, or no, the
was
new
a
one from
remake.
26, the one from
No,
2016 is actually a sequel
to
to
the
the
original.
first Blair Witch Project
Okay,
that does not acknowledge that the second one ever happened.
of course, yeah.
I'm pretty sure.
It's a legacy sequel.
So,
Yeah, so I just.
but I'm saying that idea is interesting, but it's never executed well. I'm waiting to see. I
Mhm.
don't know of any exceptions I've seen really, but I'm sure one will come to me if I've seen it.
And okay, let's and if I do the flip side of that, yes, what if the populace and the police are all well versed in everything about Jigsaw, knowing full well that there eventually could be a copycat? Do you think there'd be some kind of like a police protocol for how we deal with these things, instead of having detectives go run off on their own so they could get waxed and literally waxed off, or getting their fingers pulled off their hands? I'm like, come on.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Like, have the Jigsaw task force,
Yeah.
or make it a federal, the feds were involved in some of the earlier movies, so there's definitely a higher level awareness of um, Tobin Bell's character, John Kramer.
Yeah.
You saw him, I think, briefly in a couple of photographs, and
Yeah.
his morgue shot was actually on
Sure.
the big police board. God, I miss him being in these movies.
He's a great actor. Yeah.
He is, and he's wonderful in the films, and it's a testament to the writing, which I didn't appreciate at the time. Again, until I went back and watched them last year, how they were able to carry on with several other films after his character actually died.
Because they had disciples.
No,
No?
yes and no.
Okay.
But Tobin Bell continued to show up in the other Saw films, even though his character may or may not have been dead, because flashbacks become very important to the fabric of
Gotcha.
the series. And as I mentioned, I think on Facebook when we were talking about doing this, and you told me you hadn't seen these films before, forget about the Superman analogy. I said it'd be kind of like trying to watch. I said if they do this movie right,
Hmm.
and I'm kind of glad that they didn't. If they did this movie right, then Spiral would have been like watching WandaVision, having never watched an MCU film or read a Marvel comic book.
Yeah.
Because those films, as torture porny as a reputation as they have, they tend to be very smart. Yeah, there's some plot holes, but it's horror that the people who are making these really want the audience to get invested in and care about. That's why they were Halloween event movies for nearly a decade.
Almost coming out like every year, right?
Yeah, that was the tagline, I think, from part like 3 through 6. It was like, if it's Halloween, it's got to be Saw. Yeah,
hilarious. Yeah. And then it says it's from the Book of Saw. Look, I may be a newbie, but there was never a Book of Saw. Anyway,
well, the other thing is, the idea of the spiral and the spiral iconography. The only thing that has to do with anything is in the original series, there was this puppet. In this movie, we see a little pig puppet marionette. That's a new invention for the Spiral movie. Beforehand, they had this creepy little puppet with like a black fright wig on a tricycle, and he would have these little red spirals on his cheeks instead of just like rosy cheeks or red spirals. But it was never like, oh, this is John Kramer's manifesto about the downwards decay of mankind. I'm like, no, that's all nonsense.
Yeah, and they never used it on in those other movies. They never like posted it on the side of buildings like in this movie or something like that.
I think they used it in the movie posters, and they might have used it on, I think there was a merry-go-round trap that was painted on, but it was not like a big thing. It was just sort of like a detail, almost like in Dark Knight Rises with the little chalk Batman kind of drawn into the wall.
Right. Yeah. It's funny because some people are comparing this movie to like, well, it's not like the other Saw movies. It's a little bit more like Seven. And I'm like, no. The other way it's like Seven is it takes place in a nondescript city, just like all the other Saw movies. But Seven, you never knew what city. It was just they may as well called it Rain Central because it just rained the whole time and it was never in a named city. But look, it never, this movie doesn't have, kind of rich and interesting characters like the Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman's characters, not to mention Kevin Spacey, but nobody's mentioning Kevin Spacey anymore, but
invoked him.
I know, right. But man, you can't compare that. I mean, you can't even say that if you're going to say that this is like Seven, it's like the direct-to-video Seven. It's like, come on,
6.5.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the asylum version of Seven. No, but let's
4 3/4.
Well, and I think a lot of that hinges, unfortunately, on Chris Rock because he's got we sort of got derailed earlier talking, from that Forrest Gump monologue, but he's got 2 modes in this movie. It's him doing a version of his stand-up routine because he's got all these. He's got, like, when he meets his partner, the first 20 minutes are on screen together. It's just Chris Rock doing stand-up. It's like him talking about divorce and him talking about like corrupt cops and all this other stuff, but it's all jokes. And then you get the really serious stuff where, like, at the end, there's that long shot of him going down the hallway looking all serious, or he's in the car going, Like,
That
what?
stuff was just funny.
It was so
unintentionally.
Funny. So funny, yes.
And like I'm squinting because there's so many scenes where he's just going.
That's him trying to be all serious. Yeah,
I'm
it's like
like,
he's trying to
this is
do his
not
De Niro.
working. This
Yeah.
is not working. You know, when he comes out of that, like that scene when he comes out of that, he's all full of like glass shards and he's turned a corner. He's walking down a corridor. You know, it's always like green or blue lit. You know, and he's just like, and I'm like, okay, maybe you're grimacing because you got glass shards in your face and everything, but it's like that it is really, it's sad because it just feels like, and I typically like Chris Rock, but it's just this, there's something about this material where it's just, he's got like two modes, you know, and I'm like, ugh.
It really is hard to watch. And I was just thinking, what would it have been like if there'd been another actor in this part? And frankly, another actor for the Sam Jackson character, because
Yeah.
you know, like just take the scene where Chris Rock comes home and I don't think his door was open, or he got this sense that someone was in his apartment. He's like doing the whole like cop. He comes around the corner. It's like, Dad, what are you doing here?
That was that scene from Winter Soldier where he shows up in Steve Rogers' apartment, right?
Yeah, pretty much. But then, you know, Sam Jackson's just sitting there, and we talked about this on another movie, and I don't know if you picked up on it this time, but
MFers.
Not just MFers, but the damn N-word. Like, it's all over this movie.
Yeah. Well, it's all over this movie when it comes to like their scenes together. But I don't recall it being a whole lot of other places.
It was, it was more front loaded in the beginning. Like the Forrest Gump stuff, it was all over that. Like, and that's the thing, is like I'm watching this and it just feels like they can get away with it because they are, you know, they're black actors in comics, of course, but it also feels like something that, much like the Forrest Gump jokes and the Pulp Fiction reference, it feels like remnants from the 90s. I'm like, this stuff isn't edgy anymore, and it doesn't even sound like the way people talk to each other.
No,
especially if they're cops or fathers and sons.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, how many times have we seen father and son, like, you know, career police, whatever, in movies, and you know, done well, you know, kind of estranged, or you know, the son has to live up to the father's reputation, or you know, the father has let down the son and he wants to be a better cop than his father ever was. You know, it's interesting stuff. It's compelling. It's really about a family dynamic. This just felt like, hey man, it's Chris Rock and Samuel Jackson. They're hanging out while they're making a movie.
Right. I mean, and that's the thing. It's like Sam Jackson does not strike me as, I mean, I've seen police chiefs on television. They're not that guy. He's not the kind, they're not, well, they have composure to some extent. They might get like kind of boisterous, but I don't get the feeling that they're talking, you know, all street and crazy like, and losing control and beating up on a cop and
you want to play games,
saying, yeah, well, yeah, it's like if you don't, if the person, I'm gonna call down to dispatch and find out which cop was closest to the vicinity
to my son.
I'm gonna shoot that person right now. And then he starts like pistol whipping the guy. I'm like, in front of everybody. No.
And that's how he got that scar on his face that the camera kept on leaning on. Good Lord. That's why they don't like Chris Rock, because they don't even like his father.
It's just it's disappointing, and I hope this movie doesn't deter you from, at some point, I would say at least watch the first Saw movie.
Okay.
And then if it's, you know, I don't know if there's like an edited version, or if there's like a squeamish cut on YouTube where someone's like, if you want to watch the Saw franchise, but just for the story, it's like reading Playboy, but cutting out all the centerfolds.
That's like watching, what are those, Final Destination movies? If you want to watch those for just all the weird kills, you'd actually probably be better off in that sense. But I'm sure somebody has a YouTube clip of all the Saw killings.
Well, but, you know, I'm saying if you want to skip the Saw killings and just watch it for like how the story all comes together, because it really is this brilliant kind of tapestry. It's as if someone took those police boards that have all the red string and the photographs and stuff, and actually showed you how everything connected. That would be the Saw franchise.
Minus Jigsaw, though, you're saying the movie Jigsaw.
I mean, that's, that's interesting just because at the very end you find out what's really going on. Like, oh, that's neat. Someone could have just told me that and saved me an hour and a half.
It was Ellen DeGeneres all along.
That would be
Um,
quite the film. But no, talking about the corrupt cops, you know, Donnie Wahlberg is one of them. He's the main
was he in
character.
two?
Yeah, he was in a few of them.
Oh, okay.
Because his character is the centerpiece of two, and he pops up into some of the other films, sometimes in flashback, sometimes in present day, because there's sort of a mystery as to what happened to his character at one point. But he's a corrupt cop, but he's also, you know, you get the sense that he's a good cop who just goes to extreme measures to, you know, get things done, but he's also kind of a piece of crap to his son. So when Jigsaw starts messing around with him, it's a big test of his character. It really is about something. And then other cops kind of get involved in the subsequent movies, and their character is being tested too. The Jigsaw killer, or the Jigsaw acolyte, as is revealed in this movie, there's kind of an interesting idea there.
Sure.
But the problem is they've painted all police as being worthy of being, you know, hung up
Yeah.
and tortured to death. If there'd been some kind of a contrast for Chris Rock to really protest and say, no, this is wrong for X reasons instead of you're a dirtbag, I think that would have been more compelling. This movie isn't as smart. It's not nearly as smart as the least intelligent of the previous films.
It would have been really interesting if the killer that we wind up, learning about in this movie, if his father was also a cop, and maybe his father at one point, worked with um, Banks's father as the chief, and he wasn't just a witness, who was just, unfortunately, blown away. It would have been interesting, that here's two characters who are eventually partnered up, and both of their fathers are kind of like, career, legacy police, officials. That would have been interesting. How they're, living their lives differently. I again, I don't know about the other movies, but what this movie reminded me of, it is just, I'm a huge fan of Silence of the Lambs, but there's one scene that really bugged me about Silence of the Lambs, that one implausible scene to me that really bugged me about Silence of the Lambs is when Lecter escapes from the caged prison that was like in kind of like a gymnasium type of thing.
Yeah.
And he does that by basically hoisting up this guard who is bigger than him and heavier, and opens him up, and he's like laid out there and the lights hitting him and everything. He's like,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, how does one Anthony Hopkins guy do that? I mean, so a lot of what I'm seeing here in this movie, I'm like, okay, this guy's, as far as we can tell, he's working alone. How does one guy do all this crap?
Well, and it's funny because that was the question that was being asked after the first Saw film came out. Mm-hmm. Now, depending on who you ask and who you believe, the subsequent Saw movies were set up to fill in that plot hole. Mm-hmm. Now, if that's the case, it's a brilliant job, because the idea was there was a lot more going on. And I can't really get into...
I'm sure he had people he was working with, and he had his disciples and all that.
Why it was a surprise, I can't really get into that without spoiling it. But yeah, so it very may well be that there are other people helping out the killer in this movie, but I just don't feel like this isn't gonna relaunch a new Saw franchise.
No.
There's not
especially the way this ended. It's like I felt like I got bounced out of a Zoom meeting or something. I was like, what? What just happened? Hello? And it's just like directed by, I'm like, really?
Well, and that's the other thing is, like, I didn't look up who directed this. So when I saw Darren Lynn Bousman's name on the screen, I was like, no.
It's really weird.
Really good stuff in the other films.
It's really weird because I don't know, maybe in an effort to try and do something different, it just, again, I haven't seen the others, but it felt like a very predictable kind of more of the same. Like, if you are a huge Saw fan, you'll kind of be insulted by this movie.
I think that's a safe,
Yeah.
unless you're just going for the gore effects. But that's sort of the other problem is there's so much of this movie that feels like a really lame episode of like Law and Order,
Yeah.
like
Or
it's every
gross episode.
right, but it's
Yeah.
every cop procedural you've ever seen, punctuated by a total of like maybe 6 minutes, if that, of like gore effects spliced throughout this, hour and a half movie. And it's so dull because Chris Rock is so goofy. The characters are all terrible. They're poorly drawn. There's just nothing to really hook you like there is in these other films, because usually there's like a ticking clock element to these stories.
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to find someone, or you know the people are in danger, or there is one setting in which a bunch of people have been drawn together into one large trap,
Yeah.
and the cops are trying to find out where they are or figure out how to save them.
Yeah.
In this, it's just another serial killer movie with saw traps.
I wondered, did escape rooms become popular after these movies?
I don't know if they were around before these movies, but I know
Yeah.
they definitely, there was some
Yeah.
overlap there.
Yeah.
There's a movie coming out next week that has some elements of like Saw in it, but
What's that?
it's called Sound of Violence. I talked to the director yesterday, so that interview will be out next week. But that is a film about a music student who basically makes her art by killing people. And she develops these elaborate body horror instruments.
Okay. Yeah.
It's much smarter. It reminded me of old school Saw. It's not explicitly torture.
I thought you were going to say old school with Will Ferrell.
A little bit of that too. No,
sure.
No, I mean, that's the thing, is like, that is a little independent film that's coming out, on demand. And the idea that this movie is getting all this budget and promotion behind it, it's just kind of gross to me. So I think if there's a recommendation, I'd say watch Sound of Violence instead of this thing.
Yeah, again, as I was watching this, I was just like, it's a shame, because there is an interesting story here about just, you could go down the route of police corruption. And, although we kind of have seen the stories of one cop trying to go up against, the system and but the fact that, he, everywhere he turns, he can't, catch a break. He's not backed. He's not believed in. People just kind of like, oh yeah, okay, come on. And even his captain, it's just such a waste character. It's just like, especially the scene where she gets off. I'm like, this is so stupid, because the whole thing was like, Jigsaw lured us away from the precinct, and what? Everybody left the precinct? I don't think so.
Well,
and
after what happened, no, this takes place continuity wise before The Dark Knight Rises, so they didn't realize that getting the cops in one place was stupid.
Right, and it's just like, okay, why? You're the captain of police, so obviously, I mean, you had to have gotten that position for some reason, but obviously it wasn't brains, because you go down and investigate in the police precinct basement by yourself. Again, another cop by yourself, and oh no, I'm like, come on.
Yeah, it's really dumb. And also with that, I gotta talk about the actual voice on these tapes. The previous Saw movies, I think it originally started out, it was Tobin Bell, and he's got this kind of like a husky voice that when put through the distorter is like, I want to play a game. This sounded like a weird, it was like this weird Midwest kind of like, Detective Vasquez, you've made some choices and you've got to get out of this trap. I'm like, what is going on here?
Yeah,
it's not threatening, it's not mysterious. Yeah, it sounded like a woman trying to disguise her voice as a man, but she's like from rural Wisconsin, and so she has like completely flat affect.
Yeah, didn't work.
It's funny. It's like, when I was listening to, I think I first noticed it in the trailer. I'm like, okay, there's an explanation. That's a gag. But no, that's the real deal.
And even the reveal of the killer, it was so obvious, because the problem is, so many cops get killed. And then one of the cops gets killed, and you'd think they would have made a bigger deal out of it. And, he gets skinned alive, and he's left hooked up in a meat locker or whatever. And earlier on, we learned that, he had a wife and a kid. And the next scene should have been like Chris Rock's character showing up at the door of that wife and kid saying, but nope, nothing. We just move on. I'm like, come on, really?
Well, and it's also this weird, like, I almost wanted there to be a slide whistle side effect, because it goes from this scene of like Chris Rock and his partner getting, and I'm kind of getting into spoiler territory here, so why are you listening to this if you haven't watched Spiral? But also
you signed an NDA.
Well, I'll tag it with spoilers, but no, they get into the car, Rock and his partner, and the partner goes, it's a good thing they made us partners. The next scene is where they discover this guy's body. I'm like, there's no like, and the movie itself doesn't, they built up this like, oh, I'm finally starting to kind of like this guy, but there's no real remorse. It's like, we've got to get this son of a bitch.
I've been wanting to do this since I was 12 years old.
Yeah. I did like the idea of how this character pulled off his disguise. Like there's a little trick with a computer and a crying baby.
Yeah, that was kind of Ferris Bueller-ish.
Yeah. Well, my God, this movie is just obsessed with other better movies
from the 80s. Yeah. I guess once there's the big reveal, I started to, not that I really ever cared, but I just started to care less and less. And I almost felt kind of embarrassed for Samuel Jackson. I'm like, dude, all right. Props for you for doing Snakes on a Plane, man. You really got into that. That was a fun movie. You're down to stuff like this. You got Totally Wasted and Deep Blue Sea. Man, I know you're down for stuff like this, but what are you doing here? Is this because Rock is involved or what? At the end, he's strung up like a marionette, and it's just it's ridiculous. It's like, what?
Well, it's that, plus it's the the botched social commentary angle where he's strung up like a marionette. Just the SWAT team bursts into the room, and all of a sudden this shotgun drops out of his sleeve as part of the trap, and he's raising his arm like, stop. And then the cops say, oh my God, it's a black guy with a gun. And then they all blow him away. I'm like, yeah, it's real subtle here, guys.
Mm-hmm. But plus, they're wearing armor, and this guy's strung up, and he's like, well, whatever. It's just,
well, I can understand, because that's like training, right? If someone raises a gun to shoot at the cops, you're not going to be like, wait, let's find out what's going on here. That's, it's an offensive maneuver, right?
Yeah.
But in terms of what's going on with Rock's character in this climax, I don't understand it, because the person who is the Jigsaw killer or the copycat, whatever, spoilers, it's not John Kramer. He's not back from the dead. His idea is he's going to recruit Chris Rock to help him weed out corrupt cops and kill them, which would be the act of corruption, which betrays this whole idea, which is that this guy thinks that Chris Rock is the last honest cop, in America, basically.
Right. So why would he do that?
Right.
No wonder it ended so abruptly.
Well, also, the dirtbag in the subway who got his tongue ripped out, the guy who lied to people on the stand. Chris Rock is going on and on, like yelling at people about how
he was my friend.
Like, he was my friend, and our families knew each other. I'm like, but you also kind of knew he had a reputation for lying on the stand. Like,
so where does that put you?
Yeah, I don't get it at all.
Yeah. And it's funny because after watching this, that first kill reminded me of like, oh, now I remember why I don't watch these movies. Jeez, come on. And I know that that's probably tame compared to what came before.
Very much so.
Yeah. And it's just like, do I really want to watch all these other movies? I know they're on HBO Max right now. And I've been told that, hey, the first one isn't like that. Man, it's really a very interesting story. And then I'm like, okay, I'm sure it is. And I like James Wan movies.
And Danny Glover's in it. Danny Glover's.
Yeah, I like Danny Glover. Yeah, and I like Carrie Elway, and there's a lot of other actors in there. Lee Winnell.
Monica Potter.
I just maybe I'll try that. I don't know.
I would say watch the first one. HBO Max, it's like any other on-demand thing. You can fast forward through stuff, right?
Oh yeah.
Because maybe that's the key. You start watching like Saw 2. You'll be doing a lot of fast forwarding in Saw 2 because that was
I heard that movie like is like times 5. It's like what?
yeah, I feel like they like went up. I don't know that
Oh
they ever
yeah,
went further than Saw 2 in terms of the shock. There's a scene
yeah.
where a woman falls through a rickety apartment floor into a giant pit of hypodermic needles, and she's wearing a t-shirt.
That's all she's wearing.
Well, no, she's wearing like
Oh,
pants and stuff, but it's not like she's
okay.
wearing a sweater or leather jacket or something. Like she's getting like all
Yeah.
those needles are getting all up in her business. It's bad, but also good. Yeah. So I think we can. Do you have any final thoughts on Spiral?
I don't know. I mean, not really. I I think that there's going to be an initial like unusual variety of people who go see this, because I think there's the Chris Rock draw. There's definitely the fervent former Saw fans. Um, but I think a lot of the Saw fans are probably going to be somewhat a little hesitant to see. All right, what's this all about? What are they going to do here? Because like you, I mean, there's fans of those films who really got something out of them, and how do you continue that? How do you replicate it? This movie should have gone in a totally different direction, and I don't think it should have. Yeah, maybe it could have dealt with serial killers, but it would have been very, very interesting to do with just a series of cop killings, but to have a kind of Jigsaw copycat and try and make it, in the same vein of all those other movies. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is, and it'll be interesting to see how this movie does because we could be wrong and it could make it could reinvigorate the box office and like
Yeah.
great, now we need to sequelize this 5 more times.
Mm.
But I just get the feeling that this may be hopefully the last Saw movie because after the official series ended with the final chapter, they made that Jigsaw thing because they're like,
Yeah.
okay, it's been a few years, it's cooled down, maybe we can do something. That movie did nothing and nobody liked it, and so now they've come out with this, but I just feel like this is an idea whose time has come and gone. And I feel like they should just be happy with that. They can sell Blu-rays and DVDs and
Yeah.
posters and magnets, forever. Give that money, that franchise money, to 5 hungry independent filmmakers who can come up with the next horror franchise and
Yeah.
let Saw die.
Yeah. I mean, there's plenty of. I don't know. Have there been a whole lot of horror movies inspired by the Saw movies? I mean,
Well, I mean,
yeah.
it's hard to say because it's, it was kind of in that torture, quote unquote, torture porn era where you've got like Hostel and all these
Yeah. Oh,
other types
geez.
of
Yeah.
films and High Tension. But inspired by, I can't really say, but I'm saying
Yeah.
there are talented,
Oh, for
people out
sure.
there, even if you're not talking about directors, writers, people with great ideas for horror movies, you give them $3 million and say like the Lionsgate name or the Blumhouse name. Unfortunately, this is in keeping with what Lionsgate is becoming. It's just like really hit or miss.
Yeah. Big time.
Yeah.
Big time. Yeah. So that's Spiral.
Yeah, that's Spiral. Much like, what else it makes that spiral is the toilet when you flush it away.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Not good. Not
No.
good.
But I do appreciate you taking the time to watch Spiral, even though it's Saw 9 and you haven't seen Saw 1 through 8. I commend you for taking that plunge.
Yeah, I definitely had no problem sawing logs after this movie.
Are you talking about the toilet again?
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, that's that. And this is just in theaters, right? Yeah.
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 Yeah, which is, and this is going to be one of those also weird kind of litmus tests because the pandemic is, depending on who you ask, it's kind of coming to an end and people are going back to the movies allegedly.
And
But I
the
feel like this
CDC
was
just made that announcement. Yeah.
right. But I wonder if a movie that's just going to theaters, I wonder if that's a little bit too soon because I feel like this should have been a simultaneous release on, I don't think Lionsgate has the same deal as like HBO Max or anything, but like an
Yeah.
on-demand thing. I feel like this would have been better just on demand instead of in theaters.
Yeah. It's like, I forget whether or not you saw that Denzel Washington thing, Little Things.
No, I didn't.
Okay. I mean, I don't know how well that would have done in the movies or in the theater, but it was kind of just like a perfect release for HBO Max. It's just like, oh, it's a new movie with Denzel Washington on HBO Max. I could sit on my couch and watch it. You know, this is a new movie with Chris Rock and Samuel Jackson. Okay, but you know,
well, it's kind of the thematic problem too. Is like, okay, we're finally going back to the movies after this terrible year. What are we going to see?
a terrible movie.
A terrible movie about police brutality. Like, all right.
Yeah, you really. I mean,
escapism.
You just really need a dumb, silly comedy or something just to get people out there.
And this movie had that. No,
that would have been an interesting route too. You know, both actors have done dumb, silly comedies.
Yeah.
So yeah.
All right, sir. Well, thank you very much. We'll be talking about other movies soon. Much better ones, I'm sure.
I hope so.
Well, okay, yeah, not so sure, but
they got to be out there.
Wood. Yeah, they got to be better than this for sure. But yeah, take care, sir, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you.